Thank you, Barry, for that great introduction. Okay, so...
I think if we point it at...
what am I pointing?
Try to point it at that, maybe that'll help.
There we go.
Here we go.
Right, so I will be talking a little bit about the experience at Nature journals of having introduced a reporting checklist for life science papers about 6 years ago. And then I'll spend most of the rest of my time talking about work that we've done as a group of journal editors and experts in reproducibility, Malcolm being one of them, and David Mello from the Center for Open Science, in a group called the Minimum Standards Working Group that's trying to work to develop minimum standards for reporting in life sciences. So just a little bit of introduction about what we did at Nature starting in 2013. So really in reaction to the discussions around reproducibility 6 years ago, we introduced a number of initiatives. And a central feature of our initiatives at the time was the introduction of a mandatory reporting checklist that would be included with every life science paper that went out for review at a Nature journal. The checklist was available to reviewers through the peer review process, and the editors were responsible for monitoring compliance. And the checklist effectively consolidated items that we knew from the discussions at the time were inadequately reported, contributed to bias in the literature, and it also consolidated and set out expectations for reporting on statistics and our policies on data and code. So Malcolm is going to talk about the study that he's done looking at the impact of the reporting checklist on published papers in Nature journals. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we've learned about the author perception of the checklist. So this is data from a survey that we ran in 2017 to understand the impact of our reproducibility initiatives. And we were specifically interested in understanding how authors perceived the impact of the reporting checklist. And the findings for us were quite encouraging. So the checklist, from the perspective of authors, the three top areas where the checklist is seen to have an impact is better reporting of statistics, increased data deposition in public repositories, and better reporting of reagents. These are all areas that we know you have to push on in order to have an impact on transparent reporting and reproducibility. And very strikingly, 83% of surveyed Nature authors felt that the checklist had significantly improved reporting of statistics within the papers published in Nature journals. And interestingly, actually, when we started implementing the checklist, statistics was one of the areas where it was literally blood, sweat, and tears trying to implement the checklist, particularly for statistics. That was the area where we had, it was such an implementation challenge. And I think in the process of implementing a checklist, we uncovered a knowledge gap and a literacy gap that wouldn't actually have become apparent to us without having an intervention, a tool like this. And then when we introduced the checklist in 2013, the aim was really, the goal was to increase the standards of reporting in the published paper. There was a second, more aspirational goal, hoping that exposure to a checklist would raise awareness amongst our authors, amongst our reviewers, amongst the community, and organically help raise research, the standards of research practice. But that wasn't the primary goal. The primary goal was, can we, raise the bar on reporting in the published paper? But actually, what the survey told us was also that 78% of surveyed Nature authors continued to use the checklist beyond the journal submission and peer review process in the course of their own work, they used it to at least a small extent. And a quarter of the surveyed authors used it to a large extent to kind of, further their own work outside of the journal submission process. So to us, these findings are really encouraging. And on the whole, I would say that the feedback from authors has generally been positive. They understand that there are challenges. We are asking more of the authors, but there is also an appreciation of the impact it's had on the reporting quality of the published paper. So our experience of checklists has been that they can work to shift reporting standards, raise research practice, but they have to be mandatory, and we have to commit to monitoring compliance. And of course, monitoring compliance is extremely resource intensive. Mandates are burdensome on authors, and I think, authors are constantly dealing, and I should say researchers are constantly dealing with a fragmented policy landscape, whether it's journals or funders or institutions. There's this, diversity of policy frameworks. And then finally, in the process of implementing this, it became very abundantly clear to us that we're really at the end of the process. And if we want to really shift research practice, we have to start right at the beginning in the institutions, within the labs, and try to reinforce a common set of standards throughout the research life cycle. So really very much inspired, I think, by the impact of the consort checklist and the impact of ICMJE as a group of editors seeking to introduce better standards to the community. A group of journal editors came together at the end of 2017 following a transparency workshop organized by the Center of Open Science. So this group, called the Minimum Standards Working Group, brings together editors from Nature Research, PLOS, Science, Cell Press, eLife, Wiley, and it also includes Malcolm and David Mellor from the Center for Open Science. And the aim was quite simple. We wanted to improve transparency and reproducibility, and we thought that the community was now at a stage where we could, in fact, try to define minimum reporting standards in life sciences. And by life science, we really wanted to focus on biological, biomedical, and preclinical research. So there are three outputs we thought we could come up with. A minimum standards framework, which is effectively a policy framework that sets out minimum requirements for reporting across 4 key areas. A minimum standards checklist, which is a tool that's intended to facilitate adoption by journals and researchers. And then an elaboration document, a user guide, which provides context for the minimum standards framework and checklist. And I should say again, in setting about doing this, we were very inspired by the consort checklist and the Equator Network and the way that they had approached the process. All of these outputs have just been released publicly and they've just been tweeted, so please feel free to provide us feedback and comment. So the target audience for the 3 outputs are journals and publishing platforms, but also other stakeholders, including research institutions and funders. The idea is that the policy framework and the checklist can really apply at any point in the research life cycle, during study design, grant submission, during the journal peer review process and publication, and really also as a teaching tool. So the guiding principles, quite simple really. We wanted to focus on a minimal set of elements that we knew were underreported but had broad applicability across the swath of the scope of research that we were trying to address, and that would help interpret, replicate, or reproduce findings. We incorporated a number of existing journal checklists, journal policy frameworks, as well as funder policy frameworks in designing what we thought would be a minimal standard. We looked at meta-research on the success or not of interventions like checklists, and we looked at consensus study reports. And I should say that the open research by design and the replicability and reproducibility consensus reports also folded into this work. And then the process consisted of the steering group prioritizing elements through discussion based on our own journal experience, as well as the emerging consensus on reporting standards and consultation with external experts. So as I said, the MDAR framework, the Materials Design Analysis Reporting Framework, is essentially 4 broad categories: materials design, analysis, reporting. Each category then includes subcategories of elements that we feel are crucial for reporting. So, for example, design includes study or experimental design, protocol, statistics, methodology, dual-use research of concern. And the framework also incorporates reporting along 2 levels: a minimum reporting and then a recommended best practice with an increase in the amount of detail. So across the minimum and recommended best practice, there are 2 shared criteria of accessibility and identification. And what I mean by that is for each output, we expect disclosure about whether the output is accessible, and where, if it's accessible, and second, how can the output be unambiguously and uniquely identified? So the MDAR framework is implementation agnostic. And the expectation is that if the framework is adopted by a stakeholder, it signals a commitment to include the minimum standards within the policy framework of that stakeholder, whether that's a journal or some other entity. The checklist is intended to be a tool that operationalizes the framework. So the checklist effectively translates the framework into a series of questions, and it's intended to be an operational device that helps all the different stakeholders who are engaging with the framework to comply and monitor compliance with the framework. So over the summer, we've had 13 journals from 10 publishers test the MDAR checklist with 211 authors. And as you can see, this is a very diverse group of journals, going from multidisciplinary, highly selective journals to very large, high-volume journals to selective specialist journals. We also have a platform in the mix. And the goal of the pilot was really threefold. It was to understand whether the checklist is useful for authors and editors. How are authors and editors interacting with the checklist? Is it useful? Is it accessible? What's missing? Is there an impact on manuscript processing times? Editors obsess about that, and authors as well. And then a third goal of the checklist, which Malcolm will tell you about, was to understand whether the checklist was written in a way that it appropriately communicates what it's setting out to communicate. So I'll tell you in the next slide, which is my last slide, the feedback we've had from authors and editors. I'm not going to go into detail about how the pilot was designed. It's in the elaboration document, which we've distributed. Actually, they're outside and that are available online now. But basically, one of the outputs from the pilot was surveys of authors and editors to understand their experience of the checklist. And so, we just asked a very simple question: did you find the MDAR checklist to be helpful? And so the red bar here is the response from the authors. Oops, what did I do? Oops. Okay, there we go. I won't point. So the red bar is the response from the authors. So 43.8% of authors found the checklist very helpful, and 36% found it somewhat helpful. So majority of the authors seem to find it helpful as a tool. Now, I should stress that the focus of the pilot, given the short time span, wasn't attempting to improve the quality of the paper per se. It was really just to say, is this a useful tool for the author? If you look at the editors, and I want to tell you a little bit more about the author demographics. So we had 211 authors across a very diverse group of journals. But the other thing that we were quite fortunate in is the demographics spread of the authors. We had about 50% of our authors from the US, but also a large representation of authors from Asia and Europe. And I think that's also quite fortunate that we had quite a diversity in the geographic spread. So from the editors, 53% of the editors found it somewhat helpful, 31% found it very helpful. If you know an editor, if you know editors saying something is very helpful is actually, that's a feat in and of itself. I think a couple of other key data that we got back from these surveys, and I think is we also asked the editors about the impact on processing time. And the majority of editors, so 66% of editors, found only a small impact on processing time, which we also think is actually a good indicator to have at this early stage. So I think with that, I will hand over to Malcolm.